Hello again, class. Today is going to be the second part of our lectures on the Constitution itself. In our last lecture, we talked about the preamble, which sets forth the goals that were trying to be created by the Constitution. And the second part of our previous lecture dealt with the 7 principles found within the Constitution. All right, so today we're going to talk about the actual terms themselves, all right, the different parts of the Constitution. And the Constitution has several parts. As you know from our last lecture, it begins with the preamble, all right, the introduction explaining why the Constitution is being written. Next, it goes to Article 1. Article in a document, a legal document like this, is talking about like a section. Just think of it as a different section or unit. All right, so Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. All right, that's Congress. All right, as we know, we've talked about this before. L for legislate, L for write laws. That's found in Article 1 of the Constitution. It is by far the longest article. It is much longer than Article 2 that deals with the presidency or the executive branch. And it's certainly much longer than Article 3, which we'll talk about here in a minute, dealing with the judicial branch. All right, so the first and longest article in the Constitution is the legislative branch. That's what leads a lot of people to believe that the founders, when they wrote this Constitution, were really expecting the legislature to be the more important branch of the 3 branches. You have the 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And a lot of people think that the drafters, when they wrote the Constitution, spent most of their time dealing with the legislative branch. That's the one they put first, and that's an indication that they really assumed that that would be the more important and even more powerful branch, even more powerful than the presidency. Over the last 230 years, the use of the presidency, that office, has really grown in power. And so it's debatable now which branch is seen or should be the most important. But there is some evidence within the Constitution itself and the way people talked about it back then that the original framers intended the legislative branch to be the more important one. So that's the Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the judicial branch. That sets up the courts. All right, so your 3 branches of the government are set up in the first 3 articles. Then the Constitution turns to various other issues. Article 4 deals with relations with and between the states. Article 5 describes how to amend the Constitution. And we'll talk about all these articles in a little bit more detail, some more than others as we go. Article 6 sets forth the supremacy of the federal government. And then Article 7, it's the one article we really doesn't affect us anymore today. It just set out the process for ratifying the Constitution. But once the Constitution became ratified back in 1788, Article 7 doesn't really have any more present-day implication. But the other 6 articles certainly do. It still sets out the rules for our government and how our government operates today. And finally, as you know from our lecture about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, as it was originally written, the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights, but the Anti-Federalists basically forced a Bill of Rights to be added once the new government was up and running. And those were done so in the amendments. There are now a total of 27 amendments to the Constitution, the first 10 of which are called the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk about those in more detail later as well. Article 1, legislative branch. As you remember from the Great Compromise, our legislative branch, which I'm going to call Congress from now on, I'm going to stop referring to it always as the legislative branch. We've used the term Congress enough that you should know that by now. So Congress is divided into 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Let's talk about the Senate first. Remember that was based off the New Jersey plan from the Great Compromise, where everybody has equal representation. Each state receives 2 senators. Senators serve 6-year terms. All right, so once you get elected senator, you get to be there for a while, even longer than a president, who only serves 4-year terms, as we'll talk about next. or on the next 2 slides away anyway. All right, the House of Representatives, that is the second of the 2 houses of Congress. That is based more on the Virginia plan, where states' representation in the House is based on population. Again, this should be a review because we talked about it a lot when we talked about the Great Compromise. But just to sum it up, in the House of Representatives, your representation is based on your state's population. All right, so states with small populations, Rhode Island, Wyoming, Delaware, states like that, they're only going to receive 1 representative. They're one of those few odd states that actually have more senators than representatives. Most states have more representatives, though, and if you want to talk about the biggest state, at least with the most populations, California, they receive 53 representatives. They have a lot of power in Congress, or at least in the House of Representatives. And House members only serve 2-year terms. So the thinking is the House members are the ones who are absolutely the most responsive to the people. One, because in most states, they don't represent the whole state, they only represent a region. All right, California is divided up into 53 districts. Texas is divided up into 36 districts. All right, so they only represent a small portion of the state, so they're really representing a lot smaller number of people than, say, senators and certainly than a president. And since they have to run for office every 2 years, they have to keep their voters happy. So in theory, the House members should be the part of the government that's most responsive and most in tune with what the voters are wanting. It doesn't always work like that, but that's the theory. All right, so what are some of Congress's powers? Well, as you know, they write laws. That's the main job of the legislative branch. They write laws. But what kind of laws? Well, they can declare war. Most people probably assume the president declares war. He or she doesn't. The president's in charge of the military, but to actually have a declaration of war, that has to come from Congress. Congress gets to regulate trade, coin money. That's why you don't have to change currencies every time you go to a different state, because the national government coins money. We all here in America use the same currency. Congress can levy or issue taxes. Now that is a change from the Articles of Confederation. That was one of the big problems of the Articles of Confederation. The government couldn't raise money, so it was broke. So the drafters of the Constitution fixed that problem by giving the legislative branch the ability to issue taxes. They can create and maintain an army and a navy. Again, that's somewhat of a holdover from the Articles of Confederation, except this time, because of that previous issue we mentioned, since they can levy taxes, they can actually pay for the army and navy. And finally, and we're going to talk about this here in future lessons, the Constitution says that Congress can make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its powers. That clause, also known as the elastic clause because it basically stretches, has really been used in the last 230 years to really enlarge the powers that the legislative branch has and the types of laws that Congress passes now versus 200 years ago. A lot of those come out of what's called the necessary and proper clause. Finally, getting to some of its checks and balances powers. Congress can impeach the president. That's one of the powers that Congress has to keep the president in line. Now, it's very difficult to do, and it's never been done entirely successfully. We did have one president, Richard Nixon, resign when it looked like he was about to be impeached, but no other president has been removed from office through impeachment. But it's technically there. It is a threat that Congress has in order to keep the balance between the various branches. Congress also approves of judicial and cabinet appointments. Those appointments are made by the president, but Congress has to approve them. And finally, Congress has to ratify treaties. Same issue here. The president negotiates treaties, but they don't become law until Congress has ratified them. All right, so let's talk about the executive branch. First of all, to be president, there are a few requirements, not many, but there are a few in the Constitution. A candidate has to be 35 years old, has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. All right, so the president can't have been born a citizen of another country, moved here, later became a citizen of the U.S. and become president. That's not allowed. That's becoming a little more controversial these days, but that's the rules in the Constitution. You have to have been born as a natural-born citizen of the U.S. And finally, you have to have been a resident of the United States for 14 years. All right, so even if someone's a natural-born citizen, was born here, but moved out of the country when they were 5, they can't show back up, 30 years later and run for president. They have to have been living here for 14 years. Presidential elections are held every 4 years, and as hopefully everybody knows, and as just witnessed in our most recent presidential election, the people do not directly elect the president. That is done by the Electoral College. All right, the president's chosen by the Electoral College. Basically how it works, and this is going to be a very, very broad summary. I can really get into all the details of it, but how it generally works is you have candidates running for election. Each state basically has an election. Whichever candidate gets the most votes in that state essentially gets to pick the electors. All right, so in our last election, Donald Trump won Texas. So Donald Trump and the people running his campaign get to pick the electors. Texas has the second most, a total of 38. So Donald Trump and his team got to pick basically 38 electors in Texas to vote for president. Joe Biden, on the other hand, won California. So Joe Biden and his team get to pick the electors in California, and there's a total of 55 there. That's the biggest state. All right, and so that's how it works. And so whoever wins each of the 50 states, they get to pick the members of the Electoral College in that state. And then those people, some point about a month after the initial election, they get together and they vote for president. And so it's the Electoral College that votes for the president. All right, so what are some of the president's powers? Surprisingly, now the president is often referred to as the most powerful person in the world, or certainly most powerful person in the free world. And we could probably argue whether that's technically true or not. Perhaps it is. But if you go read the Constitution, there's surprisingly very few powers given to the president. As I mentioned, Article 2 is much, much shorter than Article 1 that deals with the legislative branch. All right, so the president's powers. President's the commander-in-chief of the military. Again, he can't actually declare war on a foreign country, but he does get to command and control the military. President can either sign or veto laws that are proposed by Congress. Right? So once Congress proposes a law, it gets sent to the president, and the president decides whether he or she agrees with that law, in which case they'd sign the law, or if they disagree with it, they would what's called veto the law. The president gets to appoint judges and ambassadors and cabinet officials. Cabinet officials, and we're going to talk about this much more when we talk about Washington's presidency here in a week or two. Cabinet officials are basically advisors to the president who run different departments of the executive branch. So like you have a Secretary of Defense who runs the Defense Department, that's military. You have a Secretary of Treasury, which deals with the financial departments of the government, etc. President can negotiate treaties. Again, they don't go into law just because the president agrees to them. Congress or the Senate also has to ratify them. But the president's in charge of negotiating them. Of course, the president enforces the laws. Think about how the president does this now through the FBI. They're a big law enforcement branch. But also, through the IRS, the Treasury Department, through the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and various other law enforcement agencies of the federal government. But ultimately, they all answer to the president, and the president and the executive branch are in charge of enforcing federal laws. And finally, what students always become outraged at when they find this out, the president can grant pardons, which basically means the president can decide that anyone in federal prison can be let out of prison for any or really no reason at all, just because the president wants them to be. All right, so no matter what someone's done or been accused of or been convicted of, if they're in federal prison, the president can simply decide to let them out of jail. All right. Again, that's a check and balance power. That's a way, in theory, for the president to check the balance of the court. So if the courts are wrongfully sending people to prison, the president has the power to let them out. All right, and we can probably argue about whether the people the president lets out are always people who are wrongly convicted, or whether they're just people who, the president supports, or vice versa. You can argue how this power is used, but that's the theory of it. The theory is the president's supposed to be able to check the power of the courts. Speaking of the courts, they are established in Article 3. Federal judges and justices are appointed by the president, but they have to be approved by the Senate. But once a federal judge at least, they call it taking the bench, becomes a judge, they serve for life, or at least until they retire. And so once you become a judge, you get to keep that job pretty much no matter what until you decide to give it up or until you die. And again, that's to make the judiciary independent of the other branches. If the president or Congress could fire a judge anytime a judge did something they didn't like, then the judge, instead of interpreting the law as he or she feels it should be interpreted, the judge would feel a lot of pressure to interpret the way that the president or Congress wanted them to, because if they decide in another direction or go in another direction, president or Congress could fire them. And so that's not what you want. You want the judicial branch to be independent, that judges should be making decisions simply based on their honest and best interpretation of the law, and not based on what Congress or president would want them to do. So that's why they get to serve for life. All right. Federal courts hear cases involving issues about the Constitution or the federal law, cases involving parties from different states, cases involving foreign officials. All right, so like an ambassador, a country's ambassador. An ambassador is basically just someone from one country who represents that country at another country. All right, so most countries, just about all countries, will send ambassadors to the United States to represent those countries here. The United States, in turn, sends ambassadors to other countries to represent the United States. All right. But if you have a case involving a foreign official, like an ambassador here in the U.S., that case can be heard by the federal judiciary, especially the Supreme Court. Cases involving a state. All right, so if the state's a party to the lawsuit, that can be brought in federal court, and the Supreme Court could hear that ultimately. All right, but that's really it. All right, federal courts do not have a huge amount of jurisdiction. Most lawsuits or most court cases are going to be brought in state courts. All right, if you and your neighbor, next door neighbor, have a traffic accident, if you're both, backing out of your driveway and end up hitting each other with your cars, that's not going to be heard in federal court. That's going to be in state court. Federal courts are really only involving things that involve actual federal laws or the Constitution, or that involve parties who are from different states. So it's a fairly limited what they call jurisdiction, power to hear cases in the judicial branch, in the federal judicial branch, that is. So what's the court's main job? Simply to interpret the Constitution and federal law, and to exercise judicial review. Know this term, understand the term. We're going to talk about where it comes from here in a few weeks, but know that judicial review is the power to declare a law unconstitutional. All right, it's important that you know and understand that term. We're going to keep coming back to that more and more throughout the year, so you might as well write it down in your notes. You can write it out to the side underline it, bold or something, write the definition down so you can remember it. Judicial review is the power to declare a law unconstitutional. And this is the main power the judicial branch has in this system called checks and balances. They can rule laws that Congress wrote or actions the president took unconstitutional and basically nullify, or what we call cancel or void those laws. It's like they didn't go into effect. All right, let's talk about the other articles. We're going to talk about these articles very quickly. Article 4 controls how states treat each other, such as giving each other's laws what we call full faith and credit, and providing each other's citizens with all privileges and immunities. What that means essentially, and again, this is just a very broad summary of it, but what it essentially means is if you're the citizen of one state and you go to another state, you have to be given all the privileges and immunities of the citizens of those states. So the other state can't treat you differently because you're from another state. Okay, so if you're from Texas, if you're a citizen of Texas and you go up to Oklahoma, Oklahoma has to treat you like it's its own citizens. It can't have different laws for people from Texas than it does for people from Oklahoma. Likewise, the states have to enforce each other's laws. So, in an instance, if Texas gives you a driver's license and you drive in Oklahoma, Oklahoma has to let you drive in Oklahoma. They can't say, well, sorry, that's a Texas driver's license. You're not allowed to drive in Oklahoma. They don't get to do that. They have to enforce other states' laws and treat citizens from other states basically the same way they do their own. All right, there are some very small technical or exceptions to that. We won't really get into those. But just know Article 4 basically says all the states have to treat other people and laws from other states kind of as their own. Article 5 tells how to amend the Constitution. Basically, 2/3 of Congress have to propose an amendment. Okay? So that means 2/3 of 100 senators and 2/3 of the 435 members in the House have to propose an amendment. If they do that, then each of the states has to essentially vote on the amendment. They have to vote to whether they're going to ratify the amendment or not. Remember, ratifying is just an official word for approve, officially approving something. And the amendment only gets added to the Constitution if 3/4 of the states ratify it. All right. So 3/4 of the states have to ratify an amendment for it to come into law. All right, which basically means 38 out of 50 states have to agree to an amendment or it doesn't get added to the Constitution. Obviously, that's a very, very difficult standard to reach. All right? It's not that hard to find, 13 states who would be against an amendment. So that's probably why we haven't amended we've amended the Constitution, I think, once in the past, basically 50 years. It was amended 10 times in the first 2 years, but it's only been amended once in the past, say, about 50. It's very difficult to amend the Constitution. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. This is easy to understand. If you have a federal law and a state law that conflict with each other, the federal law wins out. All right, the state can't enforce its laws if they conflict with federal laws. Now, that's assuming that the federal law is constitutional. All right? If the federal law is unconstitutional, then that's a different matter. But as long as the federal law is constitutional, states cannot pass a law that is different, that goes against it. All right, for instance, let's talk about minimum wage laws. Okay, Congress passes laws about minimum wage. Basically, everyone who has a job has to make a certain amount of money per hour. All right, it's $7.25, I believe. All right, so everybody who works has to get paid at least $7.25. That's federal law. A state cannot pass a law that says that people in their state, say Texas. Texas can't pass a law that says, okay, people in Texas can work for $6 an hour. That conflicts with federal law. The Constitution says federal law supreme. So Texas's wage laws have to basically concur, or when I say concur, I mean agree with federal laws. Okay, federal laws are supreme. Article 7 simply says the Constitution became valid once 9 states ratified it. That happened in 1788, and so we don't today have to worry too much about Article 7 anymore. But the rest of the articles are absolutely in play. All right. As we remember, the Anti-Federalist, basically in almost in exchange for withdrawing or at least lessening their opposition to the Constitution, got the Federalists to agree to add a Bill of Rights. And that's what we'll talk about in our next lecture. Let me go ahead and stop here and save the Bill of Rights, because I do want to spend a few minutes on the Bill of Rights. So we'll stop this lecture here after we talk about the first 7 articles. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights.